Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the True North Report on the 19th of August, 2018. The True North Report is a truly independent media, and the whole point of this is to combat the narrative that we see in the mainstream media here in Canada. Over the last couple of years, people have become very aware of the idea of fake news, and fake news is quite real. But one of the disadvantages that Canada has, unlike the Americans, is they don't really have a counterpoint in order to go to. In America, they have most of the mainstream media falls among the more liberal side. But they do have some alternatives to that, the more right-wing news, which would be considered Fox News. We don't really have this in Canada. Whether you're talking about CBC, which is the publicly funded news source, or we're talking CTV, Global, Canadian Press, and many of the other sources that we have available in Canada, we don't really have a counterpoint. And many of them, they tend to take from each other and report on what's already been reported. So we don't really have this counterpoint. The True North Report is a truly independent media who is here to present to you the facts that you will not find in the mainstream media. Not if you turn to CBC, CTV, Global, even what is supposed to be our more right-wing news sources, such as National Post, which I have questioned in the past where their standing truly is, or even someone like Rebel Media, which paints itself as being the conservative network in Canada. However, they too are willing to twist the truth and only present one side, unlike what we would expect out of an independent media. There are several other independent medias in Canada, and some of them are good, some of them are bad, but this is why we have started up the True North Report. We started up to give you the news the way it is supposed to be presented with all the facts. We're going to go and try and do as much in-depth research as possible into each subject before we present them. And so that way people know that there is more to what's going on than simply the left-right paradigm. There is more that goes on in every day in Canada and around the world that people don't want you to know. We want to pull back the veil on the ones that are funding all these operations behind the scenes. People such as George Soros and their other ilks. No, I'm not coming at you from a purely conspiratorial point of view. The idea is so that you know who is really manipulating the politicians. And we're going to get into it today. So, first story we have to present to you today has to do with the idea that that the federal government, Justin Trudeau's government, is going to start putting in more regulations when it comes to foreign election interference. Now, of course, this has to do with the idea that Russia hacked the U.S. election and put Donald Trump into office. Well, then this idea has not really, after a year and a half or more of investigation by a special prosecutor, we really don't have much to go on, and there's no real hard evidence to support that Donald Trump was actually placed there by Vladimir Putin. The way that people are presenting is they're trying to make it seem like Donald Trump met with Vladimir Putin and the Russian intelligence, and then they ended up agreeing on how they were going to steal the American election. I think there's no doubt that Russia was meddling in the American election. But this is something that happens time and time again, and to think that it was just Russia would be naive. There's plenty of other nations that would like to see certain people, whether that was Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, come into office. So we can't simply sit here and think it was just Russia. Russia does this to the American elections. The Americans do it to the elections all over the world. And sometimes, even when we're talking about America, they will issue coups in order to throw over democratically elected governments. Now, again, it's not just America that does this. Plenty of other countries do this around the world. China's guilty of this, Russia's guilty of this, and many of the other superpowers in the world are guilty of this. So I have no doubt that there was manipulation in the election that took place back in 2016, but it was not the way that they are presenting it. However, this is something that Justin Trudeau has really jumped onto. He has taken every opportunity to suggest that Russia did hack the election, and because of it, it does lead to some of the problems that our two nations are having right now. The fact that Donald Trump is not being as friendly to Canada as we've seen presidents in the past, this does have to do somewhat with Justin Trudeau's attitude towards Trump. However, Donald Trump himself also is not exactly the president we've dealt with before in the past. One thing that a lot of people don't want to bring up when they're talking about who possibly meddled in the election is there seems to be a lot of evidence, of course nothing conclusive yet, but a strong evidence to suggest that maybe Israel was meddling in the U.S. elections. So this is why the Trudeau Liberals are starting to talk about this idea of meddling in of strengthening up our own electoral process in order to prevent foreign interference. This will be absolutely impossible to do 100%. But this article of the debate post says Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his newly shuffled cabinet will focus squarely on next year's election at a 2-day retreat this week, including a hard look at the very laws governing election. Now, one of the reasons that Trudeau, as they mentioned, they talk about his newly shuffled cabinet, one of the reasons that he ended up doing this is in preparation of the 2019 election. Since we're only a little over a year out, Justin Trudeau has not had the best publicity over the last couple years, and he's done a lot of things that would damage his public image. So he's trying to do whatever he can in order to fix his public image and make it seem like he's doing something of relevance before we get into the actual primaries in our own country. And one of the main things that really affect his image has to do with the border crossings that we're dealing with. And it's because even though a lot of Canadians are open to the idea of diversity, they're open to the idea of immigration, people are not happy with the way that Justin Trudeau's government has handled this. And even they're not necessarily happy for the ones who are aware of how much immigration we have each year. Canada really is a country that deals with mass migration every single year. There was a study that was put out some months ago that talked about how Canadians were open to the idea of immigration until they were told the real numbers. A lot of Canadians felt that the amount of immigrants that came into Canada every year was under 100,000. But this turned out not to be true. The numbers are closer to 260,000. 260,000 every year, but even the Trudeau government has stated that they want to up this number. They want to now make it 1 million immigrants over 3 years. This is probably what we're going to see should Justin Trudeau win the next upcoming election in 2019. But a lot of Canadians, once they figured out that we were importing 260,000 immigrants per year, their support for immigration dropped dramatically. And this is why he shuffled his cabinet around. And one thing that he did is he ended up putting Bill Blair in a position to deal with the immigration, the border crossings that we're dealing with right now. This is also why he's tried to downplay the idea of the border crossers. This is why he calls them things such as irregular migration. It's the idea of changing the narrative, changing the words that are used in order to manipulate people's minds. But this hasn't been working so far for Justin Trudeau. While he does have his base and many Canadians who they lap up their CBC every day, and they're open to this idea of mass immigration. Many Canadians, especially the ones who are free thinkers, they are not. They are not open to this whatsoever. And with the amount of people that are coming in, taking use of our public sectors, they are very unhappy the way Justin Trudeau has handled this, which is why I believe that come the 2019 election, the border jumpers are going to be one of the main topics that are going to be brought up. Even if we start seeing starting to see it subside, we're still going to see a lot of people that are going to want to talk about it and talk about securing the border. That's also why I believe that when we come up to the 2019 election, we're also going to have the Canadian image on the public stage is also going to be a big one. Justin Trudeau in the 2015 election accused Prime Minister Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, of damaging Canada's image with its international allies, even with not necessarily its allies, but just in general on the international stage, that he damaged them. But Trudeau has done more damage than any other prime minister in the past, except for maybe his father. Relationship with America is at an all-time low. We have not seen a relationship like this with America since Pierre Elliott Trudeau. During the Pierre Elliott Trudeau era, Trudeau Sr. tried to extend the Canadian border when we're talking about seas. We're talking about how far into the ocean we can claim borders. He tried to up it from, I believe it was from 3 kilometers out into the sea up to over 10. Now, what this would have done is, at the time, this was also during the Nixon administration. What this would have done is it would have closed a shipping strait that the Americans were using to get from the southern part of California. They could use it to go all the way up to the Arctic if necessary. But by extending their command over the seas, which was not necessarily legal to do according to international law, Pierre Trudeau would have closed off this strait to the Americans. So there was a lot of tension there between Nixon and Trudeau and Canada and America. It got even to the point where Pierre Trudeau Sr. was talking about how if any Americans were caught using that strait, they would be boarded, which not exactly a great move considering how at the time our military and Navy was already going through the point where we were losing a lot of personnel. We weren't keeping our Navy up to task in order to deal with this sort of thing. Pierre Trudeau was also the one who said that he felt that America was a bigger threat to Canadian sovereignty and Canadian safety than the Soviets were at the time, despite the fact that there was actually a plan in place for the Soviets to nuke Canada if anything ended up going down. This is a real plan, and this was because America's nuclear program, as well as their nuclear defenses, would have been very tough for the Soviets. But Canada did not have these same nukes. We didn't have the program. We didn't have the defenses against it. We were relying on our neighbors to the south. So they had a plan that, if necessary, if the bombs were to start flying, they would actually nuke Canada first. Yet Trudeau Sr. was the one who was claiming that America was the biggest danger to the Canadian sovereignty. But I digress. Getting a little more back on track, last spring, the government introduced Bill C-76, aimed at preventing foreign interference in elections and regulating third-party advocacy groups, as well as undoing a number of controversial measures passed by the previous Conservative government. The problem with this, though, is that Trudeau was not dealing with the situation that we were seeing during the 2015 election. During the 2015 election, we were seeing that a lot of third parties were getting their funding from the U.S., from left-wing U.S. Activist groups. And because of this, they were actually going on to affect how the polling was being done, how much support was being done in each individual ridings, the targeted ridings. And one of the main groups that ended up saw their funding come from the U.S. was Lead Now. Now, in this situation, these groups didn't have any sort of restrictions on the amount of money that they could receive. They could receive millions of dollars as long as it was more than 6 months before the election. Afterwards, they would have to claim it as part of their. They would have to claim it as public funds, as political funds. So this would have been a problem for them. But before that ended up happening, they could take as much money as they wanted from the third-party groups, especially if it was foreign money. So this was not really something that Trudeau ended up addressing in Bill C-76, so he really missed the mark and what he could do in this situation. And as we have talked about before, as I was stating earlier, Lead Now was one of the main groups in this whole activity. Now, Lead Now, during the 2015 election, they ended up campaigning on a Stop Harper platform. And this was also something that the current NDP leader, Thomas Mulcair, ended up campaigning on stopping Harper. In the end, I think this was one thing that actually sunk Tom Mulcair. I think he gained some support at the beginning, but then after some time, because he didn't really have much in the way of a platform, a lot of people ended up losing their support for Thomas Mulcair. But when we're talking about complaints to Election Canada about foreign influence in the 2015 election, there was 105 complaints in the 2015 election, and this was up from 12 complaints in the 2011 election. So this is a big difference that we're talking about. This is a dramatic increase, yet a lot of people have not really done a good job into investigating in this. In fact, in a lot of ways, this has been swept under the rug. Now, Lead Now was actually going for the most progressive candidate, so it seemed that they were mostly aiming towards NDP, but in a lot of ways, Justin Trudeau's Liberals outflanked the NDP on the left in the coming election. And this is something that also Kathleen Wynne attempted to do when it came to the 2018 provincial elections in Ontario, but this didn't really work out for her. She tried to be more progressive than the NDP and Andrea Horwath. But in the end, she ended up losing everything that had been built up by the Liberals over the last 15 years since they came into power. In these allegations of foreign money that were used to influence the election results, the claims were upwards of $6 million that were being poured into these groups, and they were being funneled through political advocacy groups. So what the law actually says is that there's limits on political donation, which is $1,550 per Canadian per year. And right now, we don't allow any donations from corporations or unions. But the way that it worked is they could take as much money as they wanted during before the 6 months leading up to the election, and they didn't have to claim it to the government. So it was a very easy loophole for them to exploit, and this is something that was not addressed in Trudeau's Bill C-76. During the 2015 election, we saw the number of third parties that were registered in the general election ended up more than doubling. There was 55 in the 2011 election, but by 2015 there were 114 parties that were registered to take part in the general election. And a lot of these groups, a lot of these third parties and these political activist groups, they ended up receiving their funds by California and New York, and this was through the Tides Foundation. And the Tides Foundation has actually been very active in Canadian politics in the past. In fact, they've ran an anti-Canadian oil campaigns. And as we know, a lot of our pipelines have actually been stopped over the last few years. We could probably chalk a lot of this up to the Tides Foundation taking part in this situation. The Tides Foundation is also a George Soros-funded group. This is something that has been proven time and time again, yet not a lot of people end up talking about it. But you can go through and you can find the connection from George Soros all the way back to the Tides Foundation. He at least has been funding them. What I pulled up here is a PDF called Who is Behind Lead Now? Researched and written by Vivian Krause, submitted to Canada Elections on May 31st, 2017, and as it says, updated on June 21st, 2017. As we scroll through and we go down to page 7, you can see that I've highlighted this one area right here, and it says, one of Lead Now's original advisors is Ben Bradzel. At the time, Bradzel was the director of strategic incubation at the Citizens Engagement Laboratory, based in Oklahoma, California. While funding via the Tides Foundation, the CEL began in 2008, the same year that Tides began to fund its anti-pipeline tar sands campaign. In 2011, Bradzel came to Canada to help set up Lead Now and has since provided behind-the-scenes help. On the basis, if these facts, it appears that Lead Now was set up as part of the CEL's strategic incubation program. So we can see right here that there is a direct connection from the Tides Foundation to Lead Now. And as I stated before, Lead Now is definitely a George Soros funded group. One independent journalist called Jill Colton ended up calling this out. They also, as we can see, were very pro Omar Khadr when the whole situation was going down last year about Omar Khadr getting the payout of $10.5 million from the Canadian government. In that situation, Omar Khadr, who was at the time, he was without a doubt a child soldier, but there's a lot more connection that is going on. While a lot of people are trying to act like he was put in a bad situation, there's too many connections to Omar Khadr from a lot of terrorist groups from the Middle East. One of the main ones that we can definitely see was that Osama bin Laden, as well as other main Al-Qaeda members, high-ranking Al-Qaeda members, made an appearance at his sister's wedding to her first husband anyway. And you'll probably recognize that that Omar Khadr was the man who ended up throwing the grenade that during a battle situation with the American soldiers in Afghanistan that ended up killing one medic and ended up injuring another pretty severely. I believe he is now blind in one of his eyes. This other American soldier who ended up getting injured. He was captured. He was actually injured. I believe he was shot and then sent to Guantanamo Bay. In Guantanamo Bay, it is said that Canadian officials became aware of his stay there but did nothing to get him out. So this is where the lawsuit came into play, and why he then ends up suing the Canadian government for $10.5 million. And Justin Trudeau, he didn't really put up much of a fight when it came to paying out Omar Khadr. The danger of this is now that we have a number of other convicted terrorists that are now looking to sue the Canadian government for millions of dollars. In fact, there were 3 terrorists actually that ended up trying to sue the Canadian government for upwards of $40 or $50 million. This is the problem, the precedent that's set in Canada, because this is the difference between what is the American judicial system, and the Canadian judicial system. In the Canadian common law judicial system, we have precedent. Precedent means that judges look towards other cases and other rulings by other judges in order to make their decisions. So when Omar Khadr received his payout, this set a precedent for other cases similar to this in the future, which means there may be in the future more terrorists that could now turn to the Omar Khadr case in order to say that they deserve the payout. But as you can see, Jill Colton ended up calling out that George Soros' organization was also involved with this. Another connection to George Soros. This is the Tides Foundation website right here, and this is the ones that we're talking about. The Tides Foundation, or also commonly known just as the Tides, they are this is the group that we're talking about. And if we go and look a little further into the whole situation, we can actually see that the connections in George Soros's that George Soros has to these. These over here are the ones that are funded directly, the organizations that are funded directly by the George Soros and his Open Society Foundation. This is also something that is worth bringing up with when we're seeing the border crossers right now. I'm pretty sure that, have you ever noticed that a lot of them are just looking pretty good for border crossers for claiming refugee status? Have you ever noticed that a lot of them wear Beats worth a few $100s, they got the newest clothes on, gold chains, yet they're coming across our border claiming that they are refugees? I have no doubt in my mind that somebody, if they knew exactly where to look, could backtrack this and look towards the Open Society Foundation to see that this is what's going on. In fact, you can even find pictures of George Soros and Justin Trudeau together. And you can also find, for a while there, Ahmed Hussein, who is our immigration minister, he was one of the people that did absolutely nothing when it came to the boarding crossings. In fact, he got into a fight with Ontario MPP Lisa MacLeod, about the use of irregular migrants versus illegal migrants and saying how she is divisive and un-Canadian. You can actually find a picture also of Ahmed Hussein standing next to George Soros' son. This idea of open borders is exactly what George Soros wants, and this is why the Trudeau government pushes for it. But more importantly, as we go down, we can go down the list and see. These are all in alphabetical order, just showing what is being funded by George Soros' organization. And if we hold on, we need to find out where it is. Oh, I'm not far enough. Well, we have Think Progress, number one. That's a big one. Actually, the Center for American Progress also gets a lot of funding from Soros and his goons. And then here we have down here the Tides Foundation and Tides Center. And so we can see here, once again, another connection that we have here. This is all too little too late when we're discussing Bill C-76 and where the funding was coming from during these elections, and why Trudeau has not really done much when it comes to dealing with the migration crisis. We also have here that the Tides Foundation funded a non-for-profit organization of a terrorist bomber. As it says here, a few years ago, after his release from federal prison, a convicted terrorist bomber who has been embraced by the activist left got a grant from the George Soros-funded Tides Foundation. Speedway bomber Brett Kimberlin is a director and founder of Justice Through Music Project, a 7-year-old Bethesda, Maryland-based 501c3 non-profit entity. Kimberlin, as blogger Liberty Chick previously reported, spent nearly 17 years in prison after being convicted of launching a week-long bombing spree that terrorized the residents of Speedway, Indiana in the late 1970s. One of the blasts horribly maimed a man so badly that it directly led to the man's suicide a few years later, which was proven when the widow of that bombing victim successfully sued and won a civil judgment against Kimberlin for $1.6 million. Are you beginning to understand? Are you beginning to understand that the idea of a left-right paradigm is just a joke? Because even when we're talking about right now, there's a lot of focus on the left wing of politics, and I think that's because the left has gotten such a large support over the last little bit. They're getting supported by the mainstream media, and they've gotten really violent, so they're ones that a lot of people pay attention to. But if we're talking about the right wing of politics, well, they're the ones that are supporting and getting funding from the Zionists of Israel. This is why the idea of the left-right paradigm, something that I held on to for years, and I would say only recently have started to abandon. This is what it's all about. It's meant to stroke the division of the people so we don't know who's really pulling the strings and how badly we're being screwed over. When it comes to the left wing of politics, they're pushing a Marxist idea, and this is what George Soros is. George Soros is a Marxist. And he actually stated before that he doesn't consider himself a Zionist, and he doesn't even necessarily support Israel the way that other Jews do. However, on the other end, do you ever notice that the right is extremely defensive of Israel and its stances? This is because where does most of the funding come from? It comes from the Zionist Jews. And if you don't believe me, you can go look up and see some of the people that are connected to Donald Trump himself. A lot of them are Zionist Jews. And some of them even have connections all the way back to the Israeli government, including Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel. One of these is Jared Kushner, who was one of a member of the Trump administration for a while. I think he may actually still be there. I'd have to look it up again just to be sure. But he's also his Trump's son-in-law, if I'm remembering correctly. And he has told stories before about how Benjamin Netanyahu had actually come over to his house when he was younger and slept in his bed. Not at the same time, but he had actually spent time with the Kushners. And the Kushners and Benjamin Netanyahu are good friends. We need to realize who's really pulling the strings here. So why now, when we've already known for years, why now are we starting to see Justin Trudeau talk about needing to beef up bills to prevent foreign election interference? There's a few different reasons. One is because, well, they're playing up on the idea of the Russians hacking the election. So this is one thing that's sort of driving them. Another reason is because I don't believe that the funding is really working anymore. I don't believe this idea of these groups such as George Soros's Tides Foundation and Open Border Society. These sort of funding is not really doing it for Justin Trudeau anymore. So he needs to do everything that he can in order to prevent the Conservatives from gaining any ground when it comes to the 2019 election. Andrew Scheer's Conservatives have been steadily gaining in the polls, and while this does fluctuate and there are times where Justin Trudeau gains more support, this coming election is really going to come down to the Conservatives versus the Liberals, because even though the NDP, the New Democratic Party, has gained a new leader in Jagmeet Singh back in, I believe it was October of 2017. So we're pushing almost a year since that time. Jagmeet Singh is still not sitting in Parliament. There were some reports recently about him looking to run in specific ridings, but all in all, he has not made much of an impact, and in fact, people don't seem very keen on him. A lot of people have actually abandoned their support for the New Democratic Party because he's done absolutely nothing but virtue signal. This is something that Justin Trudeau does as well, but he's currently sitting in office. So this is where the 2019 election is going to come down to. Andrew Scheer versus Justin Trudeau. So he needs to do everything he can in order to prevent Andrew Scheer from gaining any sort of support. But at the same time, he's being very hypocritical, because not only had the Liberal Party received these foreign donations, in fact, the Trudeau Foundation has received a lot of these foreign money as well. If you've ever gone to look up at the funding for the Trudeau Foundation, as soon as Justin Trudeau took over the reins of the Liberal Party of Canada, they started to see more foreign funds. And then suddenly, when he became the Prime Minister, those funds skyrocketed. Somebody is using, just like the Clinton Foundation, the idea of the Trudeau Foundation is this is where people can put their money towards Justin Trudeau. Instead of them giving it to him directly or to the party directly, they put it in through the Trudeau Foundation. It gets watered down with the money that is used for the foundation, but you can guarantee that a number of this money is being pocketed by Trudeau and by his brother, who also is a member of the Trudeau Foundation. In fact, even some of the members in Parliament right now are members of the Trudeau Foundation, or at least some of the Trudeau's inner circles are members of the Trudeau Foundation and have been in the past. One of the main ones is Gerald Butts, which is the principal secretary to Justin Trudeau, and who makes his appearance known time and time again. In fact, even Gerald Butts has some interesting situations of what's gone on in Parliament, because there was a report a while ago about how Gerald Butts showed up to caucus meetings. Nobody voted for Gerald Butts. He is not a sitting MP. He is one of Justin Trudeau's childhood friends. Yet for some reason, he's making an appearance at the caucus meetings. There's no reason for him to be there. This is really what we're seeing from this idea of strengthening the regulations. Now, I'm not necessarily opposed to strengthening the regulations, but you can bet that Justin Trudeau is using everything in his power in order to try and make sure he has an advantage in this coming election. We saw the same thing from the Ontario Liberals during this past election, where a few months, we're talking maybe 6 months before the election, they changed the rules, including the rules of funding that go to each party. They were going to fund on taxpayers' dollars, but it all had to do, how much money you were receiving had to do with how well you did in the 2014 provincial elections. So clearly, Kathleen Wynne, at the time, who was the leader of the Ontario Liberals, she had gained the most support. She had the biggest party in Parliament at the moment. So she was going to receive the most funds, and then every other party after her, the Conservatives, the NDP, they were going to have less funds than her, which gave her an advantage. You can guarantee that we will see something similar in this new bill that is being talked about. In fact, a lot of people are believing that Justin Trudeau is going to try and steal this upcoming election. We'll see what ends up coming out of that, because it's a little too early to say for sure. But even in the Ontario election that just went down on June 7th, they suddenly made the switch to electronic voting machines. The electronic ballot counting machines. It wasn't the voting machines. You still voted on a paper ballot. But these were counting for you. And what has been proven in the past is that while people say that are making jokes about how there's really nothing when it comes to voter fraud, there is plenty evidence out there to suggest voter fraud. In fact, there was a hacking conference that went down, and I think it was 2016. Maybe it was 2017. It was a hacking conference where hackers all came together, and they brought in a bunch of voting machines and ballot counting machines, and were trying to see if these hackers could manipulate the results. And they managed to do so in a very short time frame using old school computers. We're talking like 2003 Macintoshes, but they managed to do this. So it's when they decided to use the electronic ballot machines, it was definitely, and I could see it, that when I saw that coming out, I was worried that it was going to be a way to manipulate the results, change the results even possibly, because we can see there's evidence, plenty of evidence to support this idea that they can be actually hacked. Maybe we'll see something similar in this new election that comes up in 2019. All right, where are we? Now, as everybody is probably aware of, or most people are aware of by now, that a little over a week ago, probably getting close to a week and a half, there was the shooting in Fredericton. Actually, just give me one sec. There was a shooting in Fredericton that took place in which 2 civilians and 2 police officers were gunned down. Now, since then, a lot of people, especially members of the media, have been wondering, is there going to be another ban that is put on the weapons? It came out that it was a long gun that was used. Long gun is a very general term. These can cover shotguns, they can cover hunting rifles, but these guns don't have to be registered anymore. That was taken away in 2012 by the Stephen Harper government. And but you still have to go through the firearm safety course. You still have to have a license in order to be able to get a gun. There's been some speculation as to whether this is something that we're going to see with Justin Trudeau, about after the shooting, if we're going to see more restrictions placed on guns. Now, Canada already has some of the strictest laws when it comes to firearms, at least in the developed world, if we're discussing about it. We have very strict gun laws. And Trudeau says there's lots of conversation about the next step, but no new registry. And this is a reference to the registry that was destroyed by Prime Minister Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. The long gun registry was put together in, I think it was 1993, by then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Actually, it might be a little later than that if it's Jean Chrétien. But as again, this article says, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said his Liberal government has no plans to resurrect Canada's controversial long gun registry. Trudeau is visiting Atlantic Canada just as the city of Fredericton continues to come to grips with Friday's deadly shooting, which claimed the lives of 4 people, including 2 local police officers. He's fielding the usual array of questions that follow such tragedies, including whether Ottawa is prepared to contemplate any new restrictions on firearms. Trudeau says his government has already moved forward with common-sense gun legislation that will deepen background checks and impose reasonable limits on the transport of weapons. Bill C-71 will also require retailers to keep inventory and sale records for longer periods of time. So this is something, first of all, let's discuss the idea of guns before we really get too far into this. See, the one thing when we're discussing about guns is a lot of people see them as the source of why situations go down, why mass shootings go down, such as in the U.S. The U.S. has a lot of mass shootings, but they also have some of the most lenient gun laws in probably the world, actually. And this has to do with the Second Amendment, which says that the citizens have a right to bear arms. So the idea is that you loosen which is being pushed around a lot, is that you loosen the regulations surrounding guns, more people have access to guns, and then you'll have more mass shootings. However, a lot of situations where mass shooting does take place, they're actually the use of illegal firearms. See, a lot of the mass shootings that people go into the statistics, people don't actually report on, because there's a number of mass shootings that take place all the time in places such as Chicago. If you're looking in the right place, you can find the news that talks about how many people get shot in Chicago. Some weekends you can hear of 40, 50 people that get shot just in a weekend in Chicago. Chicago also has some of the strictest gun laws in America. The problem is that the criminals don't respect the law. This is the main problem. In fact, even a lot of guns that are used in America that are legally obtained in some of these situations, such as school shootings, a lot of them end up not being actually legal. For instance, if an underage student, takes a gun to school, even if it was purchased legally by his father or his mother, the student does not have the legal right to have that gun. So that by effect, that is an illegal firearm that is in the possession of that student. Most shootings that take place, not even just mass shootings, but shootings in general, take place with a legal firearm. There is a number of shootings that take place here in Canada that use a handgun. A handgun is very difficult to get in Canada. Very, very difficult to get the licenses needed. I believe that they are considered a restricted weapon. Prohibited weapon. I can't remember off the top of my head. But most of the time when people have a handgun in Canada, this is an illegal weapon, yet it's not being respected by the law, and it's also being taken out. It's being used as and it's also being used to commit these assaults, to commit these mass shootings, but they're not obtained legally. So it doesn't matter to the criminals. But the one thing that does take place in a lot of situations, in a lot of areas where they have actually less regulations surrounding their guns, is that the average citizen can have it. Now, there are some situations you can point to where people are stupid with their guns. There are some situations such as a few years ago, it was either Black Friday, I think it was a Black Friday, it may have been New Year's, where two women got into an argument in the parking lot, and then their husbands got involved, and they both had guns. So they drew their guns, and they ended up shooting each other, and I think they actually killed each other. There are some situations such as this, but guns are actually used in defensive situations more often than they're used in aggressor situations when we're talking about these sort of shootings. The guns have allowed, especially when we're talking about conceal and carry, and conceal and carry was something that I was not too much in favor for a long time. But then I realized that, especially when we're talking about high crime areas, if you have a lot of gun regulation, then that means next to nobody carries a gun except for the criminals, who will go around the law regardless in order to carry that weapon. So they know they have the advantage. In areas such where they have conceal and carry, the advantage that it does have for the citizen is that the criminals don't know who's armed and who's not armed. And this can actually help deter a lot of crime. In fact, right now, despite the fact we have our strong gun laws, and Canada is a long time, especially when we're talking about American anti-gun activists, has been held up as an area where they say that gun regulations work. We are seeing an unprecedented amount of shootings in Toronto right now. If you pay attention to Toronto news, and one good place to look to is the Toronto Police Service on Twitter, where we're constantly giving updates, and the Toronto Police Service actually keep very good records of their crime stats, and it's worth checking out. We've been seeing over the last 4 or 5 years a large increase in gun crimes. This is actually also taking place in the nation's capital of Ottawa, where they are seeing large amounts of shootings taking place. Before it was stabbings, now the guns are starting to come in. The illegal firearms. So, when the criminals have the guns, what are the citizens to do? The citizens get caught in the crossfire. Now, a number of shootings are actually gang-related, meaning that it is one gang going against another gang, but we have too many situations where civilians are also getting killed. The Trudeau government's idea of solving this problem was more regulation, but there were a lot of problems with their regulation. One of the main ones is that if you go back and look through Bill C-71, which is their bill when it came to putting more restrictions on firearms, if you can look through that entire bill and not find one mention of gangs in that whole situation, which means that the only people that were having their guns regulated was citizens, legal gun owners. I don't know offhand what the stats are in Canada, but in America, legal gun owners actually commit less crimes per capita than police officers do. Now, it is quite possible that that has more to do with the fact that there are less police officers than gun owners in America. I believe. I could be wrong on that. But all in all, this common sense gun legislation that Trudeau has talked about had nothing really to do with the actual solving of gun crimes and gang crimes, which are the big ones when it comes to when we're talking about gun violence. It has to do with gangs, it has to do with drugs. Now, after the Fredericton shooting, this was something that our Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale, ended up holding up as something that the Bill C-71 did well. But again, how could they possibly be doing anything in order to stop the gun violence that is going in Toronto if there's no mention of gang violence in their legislation? In a lot of ways, whether you like or hate the man, Doug Ford has actually put money towards solving the gun problems in Toronto. I think he has actually done this at the expense of the funding towards the mental health, which I'm not in favor of, because we do need the funding put towards mental health, but he is trying to do something about the gun violence. So this idea that Trudeau and his government likes to talk about how it's common sense legislation is absolute baloney, nothing short of fake news. Because how are you going to solve the actual crimes that are taking place? And in fact, one thing that Trudeau likes to hold up is it had to do with domestic violence and domestic homicide, so one spouse killing another. If you look into the statistics, in fact, when we're talking about guns being used, when it comes, of course, he's making reference to husbands killing their wives, which is the more common crime that takes place rather than wives killing their husbands. The problem with this idea is that there's actually a very low rate of guns being used by husbands against their wives. when it comes to weapons being used, not necessarily guns, but weapons, it is more likely to be the opposite case, where wives will use weapons against their husbands, when a lot of times it is actually the husbands are actually unarmed when they commit these crimes against their wife. And I think that has something to do with men being built bigger and stronger, so that it's easier for them to choke their wife or beat their wife into the ground and cause these sort of deaths. But when it's actually women who are more likely to use their guns, use bats and blunt objects. I believe blunt, when we're talking about wives commit wives against their husband, blunt object is the most likely weapon that gets used. But guns are not used all that much. The main thing that needs to be solved by the Trudeau government has to do with gangs. Just pay attention to Toronto news recently and see how much you hear about a shooting taking place. And remember that Toronto, just like the rest of Canada, has strict gun legislation. Yet this is not stopping these shootings taking place, which means that that legislation in and of itself is not the solution to these crimes that take place. Now, with the situation in Fredericton, this was a legally purchased firearm. The man who committed this did have a license, and he did purchase his gun legally. So this is a situation where a legal gun was used in these crimes, and it does happen. But it does not happen to the rate that people like to talk about. More often than not, it is illegal firearms that gets used. Now we come to a very interesting story that took place with Justin Trudeau. So this situation, a woman asks Trudeau a simple question and he screams at her like a maniac. Refusing to answer, Trudeau deflects woman's question, repeatedly accusing her of being intolerant and hysterically howling that diversity is always a strength. What they left out of this headline, which maybe they address a little later on in the article, is that Trudeau then sucked his goons on this old woman after that she had the audacity to call him out at one of his public speaking events. French Canadians are still reeling from a video of Justin Trudeau streamed live on social media last Thursday, August 16th. The Prime Minister's fit of anger was directed at senior citizen in Saint-Jean-sur-le-Richelieu. At the time of this writing, Trudeau's bizarre response has been shared over 5,400 times and viewed a whopping 200,000 times on Facebook, in addition to those copies viewed on other platforms. Mr. Trudeau was giving a speech about the guaranteed income supplement and how much more money certain senior citizens should be receiving thanks to his government. A woman in the crowd had more pressing preoccupations than a few $100s, however, as she asked, when does Ottawa plan to reimburse the $146 million that Quebec has spent on Canadian illegal migrants? Upon this interruption, the representative of the constituency of Papineau lectured that in politics, we have to learn to listen. She wasn't listening to him. The uppity senior repeated her question, then Justin Trudeau lost all control, screaming at the lady hysterically. After a seamlessly endless tirade by the feminist Prime Minister, the poor woman was physically and apparently painfully grabbed by a man in civilian clothing who did not first identify himself as an undercover peace officer. To be more specific, it was an undercover RCMP officer. She complained that he was hurting her arm. A bystander chided he had no right to manhandle the woman. Only then did the police offer ID numbers. Canada may be glorious, but apparently its citizens are not free to ask certain questions. And we have the video we do have the video right here where we will take a look at it. Let me just make sure everything is in order. Perfect. Now that we have this, let's take a look.
Et madame, on a livré une augmentation du supplément de revenu garanti de 1 000 $ par mois, 1 000 $ par année pour les aînés seuls les plus vulnérables. On a investi des milliards de dollars pour l'allocation canadienne aux enfants, qui a fait une énorme différence dans la vie des familles à travers la province et le pays. Madame, une des des choses importantes, madame, en politique, c'est l'écoute. Mes amis, c'est l'écoute qui compte. On est en dialogue. Je suis...
Ben, vous me répondez pas,
répondez-moi. Monsieur, c'est pas très gentil. Répondez-moi. On est ici pour échanger, pour dialoguer. J'ai bien hâte de vous écouter, si, à condition que vous m'écoutiez, madame. Vous avez quelque chose à dire, madame?
Je veux savoir quand vous allez nous remettre le 146 millions qu'on a payé pour vos immigrants illégaux.
OK. Madame.
C'est nous autres qui avons payé pour ça.
Intolérance par rapport aux immigrants, ça n'a pas sa place au Canada. Cette intolérance par rapport à la diversité. Votre intolérance n'a pas sa place ici. Nous sommes libéraux ici. Nous savons que la diversité ne sorte pas. Jamais une sorte de part des autres. Votre intolérance n'a pas sa place.
Mais vous, là, M. Trudeau,
merci beaucoup, mes amis. Il faut que vous sachiez que la force, c'est de se rassembler et non de s'aimer. Non de s'aimer la peur, non de s'aimer l'intolérance, madame. Oui, madame.
On n'est pas un territoire mohawk! 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 On n'est pas un territoire mohawk!
Avez-vous de la tolérance envers les Québécois de souche? Allez-y, allez-y, ramper, donner la main à ce...
Non, mais c'est assez.
Hey, il n'y a pas de strike, il n'y a pas de parler.
Moi, je me fais plus des avoir des opinions, mais peut-être les écrire sans les crier. Elle s'en va là. Elle s'en va là.
Moi, je m'en allais par là-bas, le fond, la Monsieur Trudeau, êtes-vous tolérant avec les Québécois de souche? Êtes-vous tolérant avec les Québécois de souche? Répondez-moi, vous non plus, vous n'avez pas votre place au Québec. Avez-vous compris? Vous n'avez pas votre place au Québec.
Je suis fier québécois, madame. Je suis fier québécois. Plaisir de vous voir. Merci. Plaisir de vous voir. Moi, je vous dis 100%.
Regardez qu'est-ce qu'on fait, là, madame. Regardez qu'est-ce qu'on fait.
Là, vous allez venir avec moi?
Non.
OK. Là, vous allez venir avec moi maintenant?
Regardez.
Lâche-moi, tu me fais mal, mes os ils cassent, je fais de l'ostéoporose.
Bon, regardez.
Lâche-moi, là.
Je veux juste...
Regarde, je vais être bien.
Je veux juste...
Non,
Elle menace pas personne. Elle menace pas personne.
j'ai pas menacé
Elle a juste voulu
personne.
parler.
J'ai le droit de dire mon opinion à M. Trudeau. Fait que lâche-moi. As-tu compris? Tu me lâches.
Vous avez aucune autorité pour tenir cette madame-là. Vous avez aucune autorité.
Hey, tu m'as fait un bleu, regarde. Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Ben, j'ai juste dit à M. Trudeau, j'ai posé des questions à M. Trudeau, c'est tout.
Elle doit
Ben, il m'a ramassé. J'ai le droit à mes opinions, puis je suis pas obligée de t'arrêter quand je vais demander des questions.
Là, avez-vous une pièce d'essai avec moi?
Non, j'en ai pas, lâche-moi, ça fait deux fois.
C'est quoi votre nom?
Tu sauras pas.
Je suis policier, madame.
Hey, moi,
C'est
là,
quoi votre badge, monsieur? On veut l'avoir.
62945.
62945.
OK, je suis policier, je suis gendarme de la GRC, madame. J'ai pas fini avec vous, là.
non, mais moi, j'ai fini quand tu m'as fait mal. Hey! Tu m'as fait mal! Regarde le bleu que tu m'as fait! Regarde! Tiens, qui va te poser? Regardez le bleu qu'il m'a fait.
OK, madame. Là, vous allez juste écouter, là, s'il vous plaît.
Non, j'écoute
Ce
pas.
monsieur-là aussi.
Madame?
C'est tout,
Nous sommes témoins de la liberté d'expression au Québec.
Je connais pas. J'avais le droit de poser cette question à M. Trudeau, puis il nous traite d'intolérants. C'est lui qui est intolérant avec les Québécois de souche. C'est clair? Ben non, c'est hystérique, c'est une femme. Un gars qui dit sa opinion, lui, il a des couilles. Mais une femme qui dit son opinion est hystérique. Laisse-moi tranquille. En tout cas, il y en a une maudite gang devant de terre ici.
Ah oui, puis vous aviez juste parlé, vous avez rien menacé.
Non, mais... Hey, Mario! T'en es pas d'arrestation?
That was the scene when this woman asked Justin Trudeau a question. First things first. There's no doubt in my mind that Trudeau has more support for Quebec than the rest of Canada. In fact, he has said it himself on record. He has talked about many times in the past about how he said many times in the past about how he actually finds that Quebec is a better province, the people in Quebec are better, and just he's also talked about how the prime ministers from Quebec are better than the rest of the prime ministers from Canada, such as from Alberta. So there's no doubt in my mind about that. But Trudeau immediately jumps on the racist train as soon as she asks a simple question from him regarding the return of money that has been given to the illegals. As you heard her, $146 million of taxpayer money, and she is a taxpayer, as is everyone else in Canada. She has a right to know this, but Justin Trudeau immediately jumps onto the racist bandwagon in order to deflect her. Now, the article that we read did kind of overstate some of the things. Trudeau didn't necessarily just unleash on her. But this is the type of answers that we expect out of our Prime Minister. He does not give answers. Not in the slightest. It is absolutely ridiculous. And the way that she was treated for simply trying to ask a question, she was taken down by Justin Trudeau's goons, who yanked her out of the crowd, and clearly they were not treating her very well. They were even, as you could see, they were twisting her arm behind her back. She is not a threat. This is an old woman, but this is the way that things are being treated. Trudeau himself has said that how he respects China for its basic dictatorships, and he presents himself quite a lot in the same way. He uses a lot of the same sort of characteristics that you would see in a dictator. Not answering questions, demanding the respect from the people, and completely chastising anyone who would question him on anything that he does. All she wanted to know was about the refund of the money that was given to illegals, and he immediately called her racist. This is the Canada that Trudeau has brought in. This is the type of country that we've developed in 3 short years under the Trudeau government. It is absolutely ridiculous. Even people who support Trudeau, I don't know how they could look at that video and think him as a good man. How could they look at him and think of him as the feminist prime minister? Let's not forget that not that long ago, Justin Trudeau was accused of groping a reporter back in the day. Yet he barely addressed this, and to him, where he had a zero policy on when it comes to these sort of actions, and he even said that if anything like this ever came out against him, he would resign. He did not. He's a complete hypocrite, and this is what he's done to our country. It is shameful. Nothing short of shameful. And this is also why a lot of people have a problem with the way that Maxime Bernier is being treated. See, Maxime Bernier had some choice words in order to he had some choice words when it came to the way that Trudeau presents the diversity in Canada. Trudeau just does diversity for the sake of diversity. This is because this is the exact sort of narrative that the Liberals require. The Liberal government plays up on this idea of diversity, and anybody who doesn't agree with diversity or multiculturalism is immediately labeled as a racist. It is a way to keep people silent. It's not a real way of it's not actually the truth, but they are creating the truth through this narrative. I just got to take a quick break to return a phone call, and we will return for the rest of this, for the rest of the True North report. Please excuse the brief interruption. I just missed a phone call and had to respond real quick. If I stop again in the middle, it's because I am receiving another phone call. Just something important I have to deal with. So as I was stating before, this idea of extreme diversity and multiculturalism, diversity for the sake of diversity, is a Trudeau characteristic. In the past, and even now, a lot of Canadians are open to the idea of diversity. But Trudeau is wielding it as a weapon and using it to silence anybody who thinks differently than him. And one way that we've seen this manifest itself has to do with what happened to Maxime Bernier recently. Maxime Bernier is a member of the Conservative government, and he was well in line for the Conservative leadership last year, but he ended up losing out by a margin of 50. He lost a share by, I think it was 50.5% to 49.5%. It was very, very, very close. Just by the skin of his teeth. And he's been a critic of some of the things that Scheer has done, a critic of the way that the government presents itself. And because of this has caused some headaches for Andrew Scheer. But the most recent thing that we can talk about is a series of tweets that he put out a few days ago. As we can see here, he says, Trudeau keeps pushing his "diversity is our strength" slogan. Yes, Canada is a huge and diverse country. This diversity is part of us and should be celebrated, but where do we draw the line? Diversity is what makes Canada strong. Trudeau. Ethnic, religious, linguistic, sexual, and other minorities were unjustly repressed in the past. We've done a lot to redress those injustices and get everyone equal rights. Canada is today one of the countries where people have the most freedom to express their identities. But why should we promote even more diversity? If anything and everything is Canadian, does being Canadian mean something? Shouldn't we emphasize our cultural tradition? what we have built and have in common, what makes us different from other cultures and societies. Having people live among us who reject basic Western values such as freedom, equality, tolerance, and openness doesn't make us stronger. People who refuse to integrate into our society and want to live apart in their ghetto doesn't make society strong. And it's worth pointing out, when he uses ghetto in this, he is talking about how a lot of these minority groups, when they come to Canada, they fall in with their respected groups. If this is Chinese, they fall in with the Chinese. If this is Muslim, they fall in with their Muslim groups, their communities, and then they don't branch out into the rest of Canada, which creates small segments of these communities inside of our own country. As we go on, it says, Trudeau's extreme multiculturalism and cult of diversity will divide us into little tribes that have less and less in common apart from their dependence on government in Ottawa. These tribes become political clienteles to be bought with taxpayer money and special privileges. This can easily be seen by the way that Justin Trudeau changed around the child benefits. It was the child benefits plan. And so pretty much you get a certain amount of money per child. However, one of the things about this is that a lot of the communities that immigrate to Canada have lots of children, which means they get lots of taxpayers' money. And even though Trudeau presents this as the money is given tax-free, it is, where do you think the money came from in the first place? It was from taxpayers who put their money forward, and then now it's being given back. A lot of Canadian families aren't that big. We're talking 1, 2, maybe 3 children who can take advantage of this. But a lot of the communities that come in, we're talking 4, 5, 6, sometimes more children. So they're going to be the ones who really take advantage of this. And because they're receiving the money from the government, it is buying their vote. Why would they vote for a conservative government which would cut these sort of, for instance, the child pension plan? Why would they vote for the Conservatives that are not going to give them the money when they can vote for the Liberals who will continue to give them this sort of money? As Bernier goes on to finish, cultural balkanization brings distrust, social conflict, and potentially violence, as we are seeing everywhere. It's time we reverse this trend before the situation gets worse. More diversity will not be our strength, it will destroy what has made us such a great country. Everything that Maxime Bernier says in here is very true. In fact, it even is backed up by statistics. This was a study that was put out by sciencemag.org, and what it said is experimental evidence for tipping point on social convention. It says, once a tipping point on social convention, once a population has converged on a consensus, how can a group of minority viewpoints overturn it? Theoretical models have emphasized tipping points, whereby a sufficiently large minority can change the societal norm. Santola et al. Devised a system to study this in controlled experiments. Groups of people who had achieved a consensus about the name of a person shown in a picture were individually exposed to a Confederate who promoted a different name. The only incentive was to coordinate. When the number of Confederates was roughly 25% of the group, the opinion of the majority could be tipped to that of the minority. And this is exactly what Maxime Bernier is making reference to. What he is truly saying here is that people who come in that don't hold the Canadian values that we cherish, for instance, freedom of expression, equality, when they reach a certain percentage of the population, then they can start changing the way that other people think, and change can come politically. And this is, when we have so many people that come into Canada every year, this is a very real possibility. Especially under the Trudeau government, we have seen a lot of people that come in from Muslim-dominant countries. And a lot of the values that come in with these people are not ones that we would believe in. We can only look to our European allies and the way that the mass migration has affected their countries in order to see how things have really taken a downturn. In places such as France, Germany, and even the UK, we are seeing how this minority group has now affected the belief system of the majority. One way in particular was that after the groups migrated into Germany, suddenly we were seeing a social push for women to wear longer clothes, longer sleeves, longer dresses. This obviously has to do when so many of the migrants that came into Germany were from the Muslim faith, and we all know how their women cover themselves up, whether that happens to be a hijab, a burqa, or a niqab. In all of these situations, in all of these sort of clothings, we were seeing how they were affecting the public opinion of the majority, and how they were actually starting to, in a way, ruin the countries themselves. This is exactly what Maxime Bernier is making reference to when he talked about this tweet. However, because he put this out, he has received a lot of condemnation from both the government, his own party, and the public, as well as the press. We can take a look through and see. First of all, we have here Rosemary Barton, who is a contributor for the CBC The National. First of all, a lot of people are making reference to how he put those tweets out on the 1-year anniversary of the Charlottesville rally, where the alt-right came together and to sort of their own Unite the Right rally. Well, people are now saying that this was intentional. So when Maxime Bernier put out a tweet about it, which actually I believe is here, just saw this report which implies a timing between my tweets last Sunday and some violent demonstrations in the US. How do you know that I chose to send my messages on the first anniversary of the riots in Charlottesville? This is despicable. Of course, he makes reference to CBC The National. So in response to this, Rosemary Barton ends up saying, how do we know you didn't time it to coincide with the anniversary, given you didn't give any interviews to anyone about anything you tweet? How about you answer some questions and defend your position in front of people that we can talk about what is fake? Thanks for watching. This is kind of a disgusting tweet in and of itself, because she is pretty much defending the idea that she can make up whatever she wants because Maxime Bernier didn't show up to tell her any different. But it is the news is supposed to report what can be confirmed and what we know. But when they start speculating like this, it is absolutely a disgusting thing to do, because they're also slandering Maxime Bernier. They're slandering Maxime Bernier about this, and plenty of people tweeted stuff out on the anniversary of Charlottesville, and some of it could be inflammatory, but there's no reason to suspect that it has anything to do with that. There's nothing in the past that has suggested that Maxime Bernier is a white nationalist. And the thing is, too, is he doesn't say anything absolutely against diversity and multiculturalism. He has a problem with how much diversity and multiculturalism, how Trudeau just wants to keep bringing people in more and more and more. So this is absolutely disgusting the way they do this. And because of it, even Andrew Scheer has come out against Maxime Bernier. As according to this, hold on one sec. As according to this article out of the National Post, Scheer pressured to kick Maxime Bernier out of the Conservative caucus over divisive multiculturalism tweets. In a series of tweets, Bernier said promoting too much diversity could have the effect of dividing Canada into little tribes that erode Canada's identity. Maxime Bernier is just paying attention to the trends that is going on in the world, and he wants Canada to avoid a lot of this problems that are foreseen. But Andrew Scheer right now is being pressured in order to do that, and even he's spoken out about Andrew Scheer, as we see here. He says he does not speak for the party. Scheer addresses Maxime Bernier's comments on extreme multiculturalism. This is the problem with Andrew Scheer. Andrew Scheer is not much different than Justin Trudeau. They really are just two peas in a pod. If you kind of look at the things that Andrew Scheer has talked about. When pressured a while ago when people asked him, is he a feminist, he came out to say, yes, I am a feminist. When it comes to supply management, they stand together. When it comes to diversity, they stand together. I will say that Andrew Scheer has been good at hammering Justin Trudeau in the House of Commons when it comes to question period. But Andrew Scheer is a man that has proven himself to not have a spine, because when it's time for him to stand up for his principles, he backs down time and time again. And the two main ones I can look to have to do with free speech and the abortion debate. Now, whether you find yourselves being pro-life or pro-choice doesn't matter, because Andrew Scheer is a Roman Catholic. So by his faith, he even himself says how he's against abortion. But one of the first things that he made clear when he became leader of the Conservative Party is he says he would not open debate into the abortion. He would not open the abortion debate. This goes against his own personal faith, but he's not willing to stand up for his principles. This also has to do with free speech. About a year ago, Andrew Scheer was the one that said that if university campuses can't promote free speech, then he would possibly think about cutting funding to them if he became prime minister. Yet whenever Maxime Bernier has spoken up in a way that Andrew Scheer doesn't like, Andrew Scheer is prepared to punish him, and he's been even threatened Bernier a few times to kick him out of the caucus. So Scheer has proven himself to not be an actual principled person. He's proven himself to be Trudeau light, which begs the question when it comes to the 2019 election. Do you want a gaping wound, which would be Justin Trudeau, or do you want death by 1,000 knives? Both are not good, but one you get to live longer. This is the problem with Andrew Scheer. He's not a strong leader, even though people have made the reference before that he is Harper with a smile. He doesn't have the backbone that Prime Minister Stephen Harper had. And that is something that people at least have to give Harper, whether you liked him or not. He had a backbone that he proved time and time again. This also comes just before the Conservatives meet in Halifax. This has to do with the Conservative Policy Convention. And so this is where they have sort of amassed a group of ideas together, and then they're going to decide what is the main things on their policy. And as we take a quick look through, we can see what they have planned. Supply management. It doesn't seem like we're going to be giving up anything to do with supply management. This has also been one of the main points that Donald Trump has been fighting when it comes to the Canadian NAFTA deals. So Andrew Scheer is not going to do anything really that different when it comes to supply management. When it comes to freedom of speech, he says 5 different resolutions deal in freedom of speech, 2 of them specifically condemning the idea that a government impose a value attestation on federal granting. Of course, this has to do with Justin Trudeau's summer jobs program, because in Trudeau's summer jobs program, he said that anybody that is considered a pro-life group, they cannot receive funding from the government. However, at the same time, he has given the money to Islamic groups who are definitely fall underneath the pro-life movement. Yet that didn't stop them from receiving their money. It was funny because at the same time that we were figuring this out, we also found out that a lot of taxpayer money was being used. Right as he was saying that they wouldn't give these grants to the pro-life groups, he was also there was money that was used, taxpayer money, for protesters to come out and protest the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which just got killed a couple months ago, and then had to be bought out by the government at the tune of about $4.5 billion. And this pipeline is old, so it doesn't look like it's going to really be able to find a seller. And at the same time, they promised that construction would continue immediately, and it really didn't. As far as I know, construction still has not begun on the Kinder Morgan pipeline. This again goes into the idea, who is buying out our politicians? We know definitely that one of them is George Soros, because George Soros is very anti-pipeline. And now we know he's met with Trudeau and many of the other members of the cabinet, as well as his son has met with people of the cabinet. And it just so happens that all our pipelines are getting killed, and then we have a mass migration across the border when George Soros has an Open Society Foundation. Another high priority resolution adds Scheer's policy to withholding grant money from universities that don't defend free speech. And this is exactly what he's talking about. And to top that's what I was talking about just a few minutes ago. And to top off that, advocates are repealing legislation that compels Canadians to utter made-up pronouns like Z and Zer. There's no such legislation unless you ask Professor Jordan Peterson. Well, this has to do with people in profession. They're making reference to Bill C-16. And this actually is true, despite the fact they're trying to say that there is no such legislation. Bill C-16 is the legislation where we have seen people that have already gotten in trouble for not using the appropriate pronouns. In fact, the case of Lindsay Shepherd is actually the real case of everything that went on. Lindsay Shepherd was just a teacher's assistant at Laurier University. She showed a clip of Jordan Peterson where he's talking about the pronouns, and she nearly had her entire life destroyed by the university itself. They were even threatening there was even, I believe, some talk about possibly getting her in trouble with the law over this. So it is a very real legislation. Don't let National Post tell you any differently. National Post owns so much of the English-speaking media that you can't necessarily trust what they say. They, too, are being used. As even though people make reference to stuff like CBC News, just remember that next time you're watching. And go look up and see how much is owned by National Post. Post Media. Financial Post. The Ottawa Citizen. Toronto Sun. Calgary Herald. Vancouver Sun. All these sort of ones are all owned by Post Media. When it comes to the Omar Khadr situation, more than one resolution states that convicted terrorists shouldn't receive any remuneration or settlement from Canada, a clear reference to the money paid out to Omar Khadr to end his legal battle with the government of Canada. And then we come down here. It says a couple of policies with Canada more into line with Donald Trump's America. Two high priority ideas would be commit the party to work towards spending the NATO recommended 2% GDP on national defense, which Trump wants. That actually sounds like a good idea to the people of Canada. It's a good idea because we already don't have much in the way of military strength. We don't have the way of much when it comes to Navy, and even our Air Force is really dwindling every single year. It is better to have a military and not use it than to need it and not have it. Because this is actually what even people who talk about building up their military talk about. They don't talk about using it to then go interfere in other countries. They are then using it in order to protect ourselves should the situation ever arise. And then he says, advocate locating Canada's Israeli embassy in Jerusalem. Remember what I said at the beginning about how the left is being used to push the Marxist agenda and the right is being used to push the Zionist agenda. This is exactly what this whole idea of moving the Israeli embassy to Jerusalem is. In fact, one thing that nobody talks about much, but is a very true situation, is that even someone like Benjamin Netanyahu and a bunch of the rabbis in Israel are trying to rebuild the Third Temple. Why is that important? Because the idea of the Third Temple on the Temple Mount has to do with when would end with Armageddon. But this is what the Jews, many of the Zionists want. I shouldn't say the Jews, the Zionists. This is what they are trying to do, is rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount. This is why it's important. It was very important when Donald Trump moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, a disputed land. And now we're seeing that the advocates that Canadian officials want to move their embassy to Jerusalem as well. This is all part of the Zionist agenda. Another day I'll get more into the idea of the Temple Mount. But the idea is that when the Third Temple is rebuilt, that is when the world will fall into Armageddon. And in some ways, this is what we are seeing. I will say one thing about this, is a lot of what's going on right now is, if you've noticed, they're starting to push the idea of war with Iran. But much of the propaganda that's being used is very similar to what we saw in both Afghanistan and Iraq. More specifically in Iraq, when we're talking about the Americans. And I'm not saying that... Some have said that, even those who are talking about this have said that the Obama-era Iran deal was a good deal. I still don't necessarily think it was a good deal. However, we are seeing more and more. If you pay attention, you'll notice that Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying since 1995 that the Iranian government is just months away from building a nuclear weapon. He said this in 1995. He said this in 2005, I believe it was. He said this in 2012. He's given plenty of conferences where he says the Iranians are just about to finish the nuclear bomb. We need to act now. It was also Benjamin Netanyahu who ended up coming to Congress, American Congress, and telling them that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He's going to build the bomb. You need to attack now because the world is in danger. And we didn't find any nuclear capabilities. In fact, even a CIA agent met with Saddam Hussein in December of 2003, after he was captured. They ended up meeting with Saddam Hussein, and he spoke to Saddam for a while. And he came out and said to his officials, I don't believe he has weapons of mass destruction. As far as I can tell, none exist. But yet the war continued for how many more years? Despite the fact they pretty much knew that there was nothing there. And even if we're talking about the chemical and biological weapons that were there in Iraq, who gave them those weapons? They weren't built by the Iraqis. The Americans sold it to them back in the 80s, I believe it was. So they sold them the weapons. Then they go to war with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which was the Gulf War, for the same reason he's using chemical and biological weapons. Where did they come from? America. Then they used this again during the Iraq War starting in 2003. But within about 8 or 9 months of the war beginning, they knew that Saddam Hussein did not have a nuclear bomb. Yet we're hearing a lot of the same thing that's going on with Iran right now. I'm not saying Iran is a good country. I have no love for Iran whatsoever. But people need to realize the danger that this brings if America goes to war with Iran. First of all, Iran's not going to be easy because it's a very large country. The terrain does not make it easy for anybody trying to invade. Plus, you need to look at who are Iran's allies. Russia is one of their allies, and they're definitely going to get into war if America and Israel jumps into a war with Iran. Saudi Arabia is right now allied with America and Israel, and they don't like the Iranians. And most likely, China will also get involved on the Iranian side. We will see the start of what is most likely be World War III if that situation comes to pass. And what's the significance of all these countries that I just named is the fact that they all have nuclear weapons. Well, except for maybe Iran, we don't know for sure. But this is the danger that we're talking about of the Zionist agenda. And don't get me wrong, the Marxist agenda on the left is just as dangerous. It really is. But one is more dangerous to oneself, and one is more dangerous to the world right now. And this final point down here is talked about palliative care. 3 resolutions support widening access to palliative care. One calls for a national strategy that would specifically divorce the idea of palliative care from the idea of medically assisted death. Now, just scrap all of that, because that's not what's important when we're talking about palliative care. A few months ago, there was a report that came out when we were discussing about palliative care in Canada. Now, in this one specific home that was used for people with dementia and Alzheimer's, they were doing stuff a little bit differently. They were having their people play sports. They were having them do activities such as painting and all sorts of different things that they just don't really have in typical palliative care homes. But one thing that became clear from this report that was released is that Canada has a very low standing in the world when it comes to palliative care. See, when we were talking about this, it was ranked from 1 to 10. If you were a level 1, it was ranked 1 to 10, and if you were a level 1, then you had to close. That your conditions were so bad you could no longer stay open, and 10 were fantastic conditions. Out of everywhere they went to in Canada, and they checked out a bunch of different homes, Canada only ranked its palliative care between a 2 and a 3. So before we get into this idea of just widening the palliative care, and before we have the idea of divorcing palliative care from medically assisted death, we need to raise our standards for palliative care, because this is absolutely atrocious for a country such as Canada. But one of the main problems with this too is because in our culture, one thing that people do is they have this idea where instead of families looking after each other, instead of people, when children have been raised by their parents, and when they get to be adulthood, and when their parents reach too old to be look after themselves, people throw them into homes instead of looking after them themselves. Now, sometimes you do need to move these people into homes because they need more around-the-clock care, and they can't be there all the time. But there are people who that's the first move they do. They throw their parents into a home, and a home is a very depressing place. It is absolutely god-awful. So this also has to be a change in the cultural level before we can see a change in the palliative care, before we can actually make a difference here in Canada. And I believe that's all I have for you today. I will be back in maybe a few days or so to bring you another True North report. But in the meantime, I think I am done. Thank you all for tuning in. I am the Knucklehead, and this has been the True North Report. We will see you next time.